Good evening. Thank you all for taking the time to talk a little bit about free enterprise and to be here this evening. It's a pleasure and an honor for my wife and I to be here with you. I'd like to break tonight's discussion into three parts. First, we'll discuss the historical and philosophical framework of the founding of the United States of America and therewith the American dream. Secondly, I'd like to make several observations about Ayn Rand's masterpiece of philosophy, Atlas Shrugged, and compare her words from the mid-1950s to today's world. And lastly, I'd like to discuss several policy changes which the United States must make in order to avoid long-term devastation to our society. In order for you to put my comments into a personal framework of reference, perhaps a little about my background would be useful. I grew up in a rural farming area in Nebraska. I attended the University of Nebraska and graduated, as was stated, with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. I had the good fortune to become a chief executive officer of my first company in 1983. And throughout my career, I've had the great fortune to conduct business in over 50 countries. I first conducted business here in Great Britain in 1996 when we purchased the utility Northern Electric. I've long valued the tremendous relationships which we've developed here in England through our business activities and globally, and the globally important relationships maintained between our two countries. Now I'd ask you to close your eyes for a moment. Let's step back for a few moments to a time 238 years ago, July 4th, 1776. We're in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and John Hancock has just signed the Declaration of Independence. Immediately copies were made, 21 of which still survive today, and those copies were dispersed throughout the 13 colonies over the following weeks and months, and celebrations were ignited throughout this new world. There's another important date in relation to the Declaration, which is perhaps even more important than the 4th of July, and that is August 2nd, 1776. On that day, the members of Congress, whom Thomas Jefferson referred to as that host of worthies, stood silently and finely dressed before the parchment-embossed copy of the Declaration. They were there to officially sign, each of them, the Declaration in order to formally pledge their lives, estate, and honor in support of what they had done. Years later, remembering this occasion, Benjamin Rush wrote to John Adams, and I quote, do you recollect the pensive and awful silence which pervaded the House when we were called up one after another to subscribe to what was believed by many to be our own death warrants? Unquote. This was a heroic spectacle of integrity and courage. It's one of the great moments of mind-body unity in history. And it certainly is the twin of Surrender Field, bracketing as these two events do, the Declaration as the cause and the winning of independence at Yorktown, Virginia, as the effect. It was no idle pledge that these heroic men were making. From this day forward, they were marked men. They were relentlessly hunted by the British for 5 years, and they were destined to death by hanging if captured. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration, most of them at some time during the war were offered immunity, freedom, safety of their estates and families, and money for repudiating their stand on independence. Not one of them accepted. 9 of them died of wounds and hardships during the war. 5 were captured and treated brutally. 12 had their estates burned to the ground. 17 of them lost everything they owned, and many lost their wives and children, who were also targets. Wives were forced to watch the destruction of their family homesteads. Families were imprisoned in filthy conditions. John Hart, age 65, was driven from his wife's deathbed to spend the winter living in a forest in a cave. Abraham Clark's 2 sons were treated mercilessly in the infamous ship Jersey, which was parked in the New York harbor, and it had a reputation for turning the shores white with the bones of the prisoners that it threw overboard. He refused to repudiate independence in order to save the lives of his sons. And Thomas Nelson Jr., a wealthy Virginia landholder, personally directed the Yorktown siege guns against his own home, gave all of his fortune in support of the war, and died a poor but proud man. These were indeed great men. Other signers, of course, Thomas Jefferson being the first dramatic example, went on to live great, successful, and long lives. But on the 2nd of August, they all equally faced the same potential fate. And they all, to a man, did so willingly, resolutely, and without hesitation. They were a match for the greatness of the instrument that they'd signed, and from this Declaration of Independence, a devastating war ensued. over the next 5 years with the British until a very great day, October 19th, 1781. On that sunny day on Surrender Field outside of Yorktown, Virginia, as birds flew serenely over the silent battlefield, George Washington received the sword of surrender from the besieged British Army. There sat Washington on his white charge, fronting this victorious army, and there was his army. They were farm laborers and blacksmiths, mountain men and shopkeepers. They were Scots and Germans, Irish and Dutch, and descendants from every part of England. But they were all on this day Americans at last. They were haggard and thin with long and drawn-out, creased faces. They all had visible sores, bruises, or scars. They wore hunting shirts and motley jackets, filthy hats, torn pants, often held up by a rope. Most of them were shoeless, and many wore bloodied rags on their heads and their feet. But they stood tall, proud, and silent, and their purposefulness was revealed by one thing that to a man shined in the sunlight, his rifle. They were the victors over the greatest army in the world. The solemnity, bravery, and rightness of what they had done swept through those ranks. These men had accepted Patrick Henry's challenge of liberty or death, and prepared to pay the price of death, they won liberty. And so on Surrender Field, the last battle of the great war for independence fought by great men came to an end. That moment ended a great struggle, and every American present was a hero on that day. Many ask, what drove these men of 1776 to declare their independence? Was it sheer luck or just a great experiment? It was neither luck nor an experiment that created the United States of America. It was the confluence of three influencing realities which brought our founding fathers together in search of a government instituted among men, deriving just powers from the consent of the governed, and to protect their belief that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are empowered by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The three influencing realities were, first, our founding fathers were children of the Enlightenment period. Secondly, the tyranny of British rule deprived the people of the 13 colonies of their basic rights. And thirdly, the experience of free enterprise in the colonies had demonstrated to date the potential of man when free to pursue their dreams and self-interest. Let's explore each of these a little bit further. The period of enlightenment is commonly considered to have been between the years of 1688 and 1793. Prior to this time, men and women were essentially governed by two realities: mystical or religious beliefs and tyrannical governments. Man was governed by those born into monarchical leadership or tyrannical dictators. The universe, as it was then viewed, and all natural occurrences were dictated by either religious or mystical beliefs. Man was not considered capable of reasoning or understanding such natural occurrences. In fact, it was considered heresy to even postulate theories which questioned conventional religious beliefs. What would we find if we went back to a time prior to the Enlightenment period, say to the year 1500? We would find that the total world population was less than 7% of today's population, with 8 or 9 of every 10 people living in little isolated villages of 100 people or less. They worked in fields and forests ceaselessly and with little to no progress. They lived in shockingly primitive hovels, little better than caves, and they slept in vermin-infested communal family beds. There were only 8 major cities back then, all of them walled, smelly, dark, cramped, and disease-ridden. The 3 largest of those being Paris, Venice, and Naples. The dominant feature of the European landscape was forest, the same forest traversed by Roman legions and through which you could journey for weeks and rarely see the sun. The average man was 5 foot tall and 135 pounds. Half of them were dead by the age of 30. A woman's life expectancy, if she survived infancy, was 24. And her wedding frocks were routinely kept in order to serve only a few years later as her burial shroud. The late 17th and 18th century, the Enlightenment period, was an extraordinary transition in man's way of thinking, and importantly, in what man's thoughts should be. In the year 1500, the proper object of man's study was the supernatural. In the late 18th century, it was the natural. The proper method of understanding in 1500 was mystical. In 1800, it was scientific and relying on real evidence. In 1500, the proper framework of governance was authoritarian, and in 1800, it was emerging as government by the people through the use of the independent, free, rational mind. Through the utilization of our mind, we would determine that our solar system revolved around the sun, not the earth. Remember that in 1632, Galileo published his famous dialogue for which he was arrested, interrogated, sworn to silence, and essentially held under house arrest. But through the works of Galileo, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and others, the universal theories of motion and force, gravitation, and the principles of calculus and advanced mathematics were understood and utilized to begin unlocking the fuller understanding of the natural world, not as a set of mystical occurrences, but as a result of occurrences which followed scientific rules, which man could not only observe and understand, but utilize through his rational mind to harness such forces in order to improve his very existence. It became understood that through reason, man could and should govern him or herself. The second influencing factor was the fact that the authoritarian or aristocratic rule of the British Empire over the 13 colonies had been recognized as unacceptable, and their grievances were amply itemized in the Declaration of Independence. In total, Americans' founding fathers identified 27 major grievances in the Declaration. They demanded the right to self-governance, and they pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They felt so strongly in the necessity of self-governance that these wealthy men, and I emphasize wealthy men, who were rich and would have grown richer under sustained British rule, risked everything for a free system. And importantly, our founding fathers had observed how significantly the colonies' economies had grown here in the New World in a short period of time, as individuals were far more free to pursue their individual best interests, even under British rule, given the distance from England. The 13 colonies, while very young by historic standards, had nonetheless developed very strong and rapidly growing economies. The bureaucracy of the British Empire had not been fully exported to the New World, and as such, business activities thrived. Of course, one of the causes of the Declaration, the British wasted no time attempting to exorbitantly tax this success and to limit their trade capabilities. These three influencing factors caused America's founding fathers to risk everything they owned to create a free enterprise system which would allow individuals the freedom to pursue their individual dreams and aspirations. They knew very well that they were providing for a quality of opportunity, not a quality of outcome. They recognized that while all men and women must be considered as equals under the law, they will each have vastly different skills, abilities, interests, and motivations, and as such, their overall outcomes would far exceed those outcomes of any collectivist, authoritarian, or socialist governance methodology. They understood that given the enormous differences in human beings' skills, interest levels, and motivations, that there would be meaningful differences in people's output, their success, and their financial rewards, which would be dictated by the value that society places upon those outputs. And while they recognized that this system would not be perfect, it would be far better than the failed authoritarian or socialistic government structures of the past. Now, the American dream was no accident nor any experiment. It's the culmination of man's recognition that by unleashing man's creative and fundamental desire to achieve through freedoms protected by a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that our society would outperform anything the world had encountered before or since. The results of these 56 men's efforts had been the greatest economic expansion and improvement in the worldwide standards of living and life expectancy that our world has ever seen. By any unbiased measure, the past 238 years have been planet Earth's finest. America's founding fathers put in place a form of government and free enterprise system which has allowed every American to utilize their God-given skills, tenacity, ambition, and strength to create their own individual American dream. It doesn't matter our origin or our circumstances. If we dedicate ourselves to achieve our personal goals, we can achieve them. Coincident with the founding of America in 1776 was the completion of the seminal work of Adam Smith here in Great Britain, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, of which I'm certain you're well versed. This was the economic companion to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Smith recognized that a country's wealth must not be constrained by a static computation of precious metal, but that it must be allowed to grow through freedoms-based trade. His recognition that man would create an orderly and efficient society if he were given the freedom to pursue his self-interest was revolutionary. The historic view at the time was that man would devolve into chaos and destruction if given such freedom. Smith's recognition that man's interest would work as an invisible hand in guiding broader societal outcomes was extraordinarily similar to the philosophy being pursued thousands of miles across the Atlantic in the New World. Man's mind in Europe and in America was being opened to the potential of a freedoms-based society and what it could achieve through man's self-interested pursuit. The result of these events in America and the United Kingdom are undeniable. The economies of America and the United Kingdom have lifted the world's economy to levels not even imaginable 100 years ago, let alone 238. Life expectancy has doubled due to the expanded economic realities, which have improved not only health care, but everyone's overall standard of living. These realities have been so powerful that even though many countries still do not accept a freedoms-based society, the global standard of living has expanded dramatically. That's the good news. The bad news is that our success has blinded many of our citizens to the philosophical underpinnings which allowed us to achieve such greatness. Ayn Rand, ironically an immigrant from Russia, and perhaps one of history's greatest economic philosophers, along with Adam Smith, recognized that America was heading in a dangerous direction when she wrote her masterpiece, Atlas Shrugged, in the mid-1950s. I first read Atlas Shrugged when I was a senior in high school in 1974. A friend of our family had given me a copy. I was fascinated by Ayn Rand's writing and her way of educating through storytelling. But while I understood the book's focus upon our society's move towards socialism and its evils, I did not at the time fully grasp its ultimate effect on the American dream. You see, my father, a simple man, was a devoted believer in the American dream. And he would cut out articles from our local newspapers about successful people and great achievements and discuss them with us kids every Sunday afternoon. As such, I grew up fully believing that I could achieve whatever I set my mind to achieving. My father's optimism and belief lessened Ayn Rand's impact on me at the time. In 1983, I became president of Ogden Projects Incorporated, which developed waste-to-energy facilities throughout the United States, utilizing a proven technology to combust household garbage and utilize the heat to create electricity. We grew the business rapidly with the support and encouragement of numerous national environmental groups who had been utilizing their opposition to the practice of landfilling for fundraising and therefore supporting us. 3 years later, however, as I entered a public hearing regarding a project we had in Florida, I saw a large poster with my picture on it and a large red X over my face. The poster read, "God recycles and the devil burns." The exact same environmental groups were now opposing our company's efforts, only months following our receipt of the President's National Environmental Award, which was received in the White House and supported by these same environmental groups. When I asked one of the senior executives of one of those groups who I'd gotten to know why they were now opposing us, he sheepishly apologized and said that we had been too successful, and therefore they were now opposing us to promote recycling. That was my first introduction to a looter, as Ayn Rand would describe. Through much perseverance and a great team of people, we continued to be successful, and in 1989, we took the company public on the New York Stock Exchange. 1 year later, in October 1990, I sold my interest in the company and stepped down as chairman. We had built 15 facilities in the prior 7 years, several $billion of capital put to work, and thousands of employees hired. However, the company has only built one plant since that time. Essentially, the looters won. A month later, I read Atlas Shrugged for the second time. This time, I fully understood her message, and it was an awakening to me. In 1991, I started a new business in the energy industry, which we later took public and ultimately sold 80% to Berkshire Hathaway in the year 2000. Over the following 11 years, while working for Warren Buffett and managing several of the Berkshire subsidiaries, I had a front row seat to watching the potential long-term damage that could be done by a business leader to our economic way of life. It became amazing to me to watch as someone like Warren Buffett, who more than any single American has benefited from our free enterprise system, would completely ignore his obligation to preserve and protect for future generations the very system he benefited so greatly from. While Mr. Buffett is famous for cheerleading the American economy publicly, his actions privately undermine it at every turn. He's an investing genius to be sure, but in my view, not a patriotic American. The antithesis of a modern-day founding father. I resigned from my roles at Berkshire Hathaway in March of 2011. I make this point because successful business executives have an obligation to defend the very free enterprise system that they benefit from. The type of behavior that we've seen recently by leaders in industry, coupled with an ever-expanding and distant federal government, will ultimately have the destructive effects foretold by Ayn Rand in her book, Atlas Shrugged. And perhaps now is a good time to reflect on a few passages from Atlas Shrugged and try to remember that these were written in the mid-1950s, and we'll try to relate them a little bit to today. The first one is a setting in the home of Hank Reardon, who's a steel executive, and Francisco de Ancona is responding to a female guest who pronounces that money is the root of all evil. So you think that money is the root of all evil, said Francisco? Have you ever asked what is the root of money? Money is the tool of exchange which can't exist unless there are goods produced by men able to produce them. Money is the material shape of the principle that men who wish to deal with one another must deal by trade and give value for value. Money is not the tool of the moochers who claim your product by tears or the looters who take it from you by force. Money is made possible only by the men who produce. Is that what you consider evil? Francisco goes on to say, try to obtain your food by means of nothing but physical motion, and you'll learn that man's mind is the root of all the goods produced and all the wealth that has ever existed on earth. But you say that money is made by the strong at the expense of the weak? What strength do you mean? Wealth is the product of man's capacity to think. It is not from guns or muscles. Francisco continues later in the same dialogue. It's the person who would sell his soul for a nickel who is loudest in proclaiming his hatred of money. And he has good reason to hate it. The lovers of money are willing to work for it. They know they're able to deserve it. Let me give you a tip on a clue to men's character. The man who damns money has obtained it dishonorably. The man who respects it has earned it. Run for your life from any man who tells you that money is evil. That sentence is the leper's bell of an approaching looter. So long as men live together on earth and need means to deal with one another, their only substitute if they abandon money is the muzzle of a gun. To me, the criticism of money and the one percenters that is very popular in the United States these days, which has crept deeply into our society, is a function of political pandering by our elite liberal leaders. Attacking the most successful in our society is completely counterproductive to our economy. We used to praise and admire success fairly won as the ultimate result of our free enterprise system and the American dream. I think Francisco's response to much of today's collectivist thoughts on success can be summed up in the following paragraphs. You stand in the midst of the greatest achievements of the greatest productive civilization, and you wonder why it's crumbling around you while you're damning its lifeblood, money? To the glory of mankind, there was, for the first and only time in history, a country of money. And I have no higher, more reverent tribute to pay to America, for this means a country of reason, justice, freedom, production, and achievement. For the first time, man's mind and money were set free, and there were no fortunes by conquest, but only fortunes by work. And instead of swordsmen and slaves, there appeared the real maker of wealth, the greatest worker, the highest type of human being, the self-made man. If you ask me to name the proudest distinction of Americans, I would choose, because it contains all the others, the fact that they were the people who created the phrase, to make money. No other language or nation had ever used these words before. Men had always thought of wealth as a static quantity, to be seized, begged, inherited, shared, looted, or obtained as a favor. Americans were the first to understand that wealth had to be created. The words to make money hold the essence of human morality. The second portion out of Ayn Rand I'd like to talk about talks about how government can pass regulations and rules in an effort to trap you. So in an effort to trap successful industrialists in her book, the government began issuing extensive regulations and laws to ever increasingly control the economy. Hank Rearden got caught in one of the traps, and the following is a dialogue between a senior government officer and Hank Rearden. "But we knew you'd slip sooner or later, and this is just what we wanted," said Dr. Ferris. "You seem to be pleased about it," said Hank Rearden. "Don't I have good reason to be?" said Ferris. "Well, after all, I did break one of your laws," said Hank. "Well, what do you think they're for?" said Dr. Ferris. "Did you really think that we want those laws to be observed?" said Ferris. "We want them broken. You better get it straight. This is not a bunch of Boy Scouts you're up against. Then you'll know that this is not the age for beautiful gestures. We're after power, and we mean it." Several years ago, my company constructed a series of wind farms in the states of Iowa and Wyoming at the urging of the federal agencies and through the utilization of various tax credit incentives. In the process of developing these wind farms, we were required to go through an extensive environmental impact process under the guidance of the environmental agencies. In the final impact assessment, which was approved by the EPA, it was noted that small numbers of raptors, including eagles, would be killed by the wind farms. Following this process and approval, these wind farms were completed. And as predicted, small numbers of eagles were killed. A few years later, the same U.S. Environmental Protection Agency approached the company, ostensibly to request our help in furthering their mission to halt coal use as an electric generation fuel. When we explained that we disagreed with their position and methods regarding coal, we were met with icy silence. Months later, the EPA, through the Justice Department, filed a lawsuit against the company, including criminal charges for killing eagles in the wind farms. Eerily similar to Hank Rearden's situation. Early in Atlas Shrugged, Dagny Taggart once again saves Taggart Transcontinental Railroad by constructing the John Galt line out of Rearden metal. Publicly, James Taggart, her brother, takes all of the credit is considered a hero, even though he had nothing to do with his sister Dagny's efforts. The following dialogue occurs between Cheryl Brooks, a dime store clerk who at the time was dating James Taggart. "Mr. Taggart, what is it that makes you so unhappy?" asked Cheryl. "Why should you care whether I am or not?" said Taggart. "Because, well, if you haven't the right to be happy and proud, who has?" He turned to her abruptly. "Well, that's what I'd like to know. Who has?" As he turned to her, the words exploding as if a safety fuse had blown in his head. "He didn't even invent iron ore or blast furnaces, did he?" "Who?" asked Cheryl. "Rearden. He didn't invent smelting, chemistry, and air compression. He couldn't have invented his metal, but for the thousands and thousands of other people, his metal. Why does he think it's his? Why does he think it's his invention? Everybody uses the work of everybody else. Nobody ever invents anything." Cheryl said, puzzled, "But the iron ore and all those other things were there all the time. Why didn't anybody else make that metal, but Mr. Rearden did?" "Well, he didn't do it for any noble purpose. He did it just for his own profit. He's never done anything for any other reason." "What's wrong with that, Mr. Taggart?" Cheryl asked. In essence, James Taggart refuses to acknowledge that Hank Rearden, through the use of his mind, through taking risks, and through tenacity and hard work, created this marvelous new metal called Rearden metal. This is the standard type of response from those who are unwilling to put in the effort to create new products or businesses. James Taggart is a clear collectivist who wishes to benefit from others' hard work and efforts. Interestingly, during his re-election campaign on July 13, 2012, Barack Obama made a similar observation when he was attempting to degrade business leaders and attacking the one percenters as greedy, uncaring citizens. Here's a direct quote from Obama's speech, and I quote, "There are a lot of wealthy, successful Americans who agree with me because they want to give something back. They know they didn't. Look, If you've been successful, you didn't get there on your own. If you were successful, somebody along the line gave you some help. There was a great teacher somewhere in your life. Somebody helped to create this unbelievable American system that we have that allowed you to thrive. Somebody invested in roads and bridges. If you've got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen. Unquote. Extraordinarily, last week, Hillary Clinton, in a political speech, pronounced unbelievably, and I quote, "Businesses do not create jobs. Government does." Historically, Americans praised and revered success as the ultimate recognition of the opportunities available in a free and an open society. Unfortunately, the collectivist led by Barack Obama has successfully created an environment where success is to be ridiculed and attacked, seeking every way possible to redistribute wealth from the achievers to the rest of society in methods certain to keep those very looters in control of government. A further example of Ayn Rand's brilliance is shown in the following excerpt, where Dagny Taggart asked Dr. Hendricks, why did he stop practicing medicine and move to Galt's Gulch in protest? Dr. Hendricks responds to Dagny, "I quit when medicine was placed under state control some years ago. Do you know what it takes to perform a brain operation? Do you know the kind of skill it demands and the years of passionate, merciless, excruciating devotion that go to acquire that skill? That was what I would not place at the disposal of men whose sole qualification to rule me was their capacity to spout the fraudulent generalities that got them elected to the privilege of enforcing their wishes at the point of a gun. I would not let them dictate the purpose for which my years of study had been spent, or the conditions of my work, or my choice of patients, or the amount of my reward. I observed that in all the discussions that preceded the enslavement of medicine, men discussed everything except the desires of the doctors. Men considered only the welfare of the patients with no thought for those who were to provide it. That a doctor should have any right, desire, or choice in the matter was regarded as irrelevant selfishness. His is not to choose, they said, only to serve. That a man who's willing to work under compulsion is too dangerous a brute to entrust with a job in the stockyards never occurred to those who proposed to help the sick by making life impossible for the healthy. I have often wondered at the smugness with which people assert their right to enslave me, to control my work, to force my will, to violate my conscience, to stifle my mind. Yet what is it that they expect to depend on when they lie on an operating table under my hand? Written in 1957, these words are unmistakably similar to dozens of leading physicians I know when commenting on our new Obamacare legislation. While it is true that America has been slowly sliding down the slippery slope of collectivism since at least the mid-1930s, I believe it's equally true that in no 6-year period have we slid further down this slope and faster than during the Barack Obama presidency. This should be of no surprise to anyone, given his complete lack of business background and his total obsession with socially divisive politics. President Obama, his cabinet, and his congressional allies, led by Senator Harry Reid and House member Nancy Pelosi, have taken every step possible to denigrate the American dream and to find as many ways as possible to trap people in the collectivist fishing net of welfare, food stamps, and now Obamacare. They've utilized presidential executive orders and decisions from a partisan Justice Department to effectuate big government programs, including climate change, illegal immigration reform, national energy policy, and even voting rights, without including our Congress or caring in any way about the vote of the people. And these collectivist actions are having a real and sustained effect. While President Obama likes to think of himself as the president of equality, the reality has been quite different. On one hand, President Obama has raised our national debt an unprecedented 220% to $17.5 trillion, which includes his extraordinary stimulus spending in 2009 and 2010, which was overwhelmingly devoted to transfer payments, including disability payments, jobless payments, Medicaid, and dramatically expanding the number of Americans on food stamps. He then added Obamacare in 2010 with its 3.8% across-the-board tax increase on all forms of income. Then in 2013, Obama raised top income tax rates, taxes on capital gains and in dividends, and small business incomes in a further effort at income redistribution. And even further, the Democrats raised the minimum wage nearly 40% in 2009. Well, what has been the effect of all this equality shifting? More inequality. Real median income has dropped precipitously from 2008 to 2013 by nearly 10%. Redistribution doesn't work. Economic growth has struggled to average not quite 2% per year. And this is truly remarkable given that we've had nearly 6 years of unprecedented income redistribution efforts and an unbelievably cooperative Federal Reserve. It's further very important to note that many within the White House and their surrogates outside are working hard to convince Americans that 2% GDP growth is now the new normal. Well, this may sound encouraging to the uninitiated. It is a disaster in reality. If 2% GDP growth is the new normal and we continue to incur $500 billion to $1 trillion deficits for the foreseeable future, our economy is in big trouble. Oh, and add in the to-date unrecognized costs of Obamacare, and the picture becomes quite dire. In short, collectivism or socialism simply doesn't work. On top of all this, virtually no time has been spent attempting to fix the many broken parts of our government, which are begging for renovation, such as our postal system, Department of Energy, welfare departments, Department of Education, and many more. We just keep piling more burden on Atlas's back, and he has begun to shrug. And to make matters worse, in a recent research poll released in October 2nd, 2014, only 42% of Americans today believe in the American dream, stated as, if you work hard, you'll get ahead. That's down from 53% just 2 years ago and over 70% a decade ago. Or as was stated in a recent Wall Street Journal editorial, and I quote, "The most disillusioned belong to the coalition that elected President Obama. But before giving up on mobility, they ought to blame the policies he enacted. Mr. Obama has been the best president for slow growth and inequality in modern history," unquote. So what are we going to do about the situation? Well, in essence, we can fully embrace the freedoms-based free enterprise system which our founding fathers began with their Declaration of Independence and culminated with our Constitution, which allows each and every citizen to pursue their dreams, ambitions, and aspirations with man's mind, skills, and energy unshackled from the disastrous collectivist philosophies which history has time and again proven to be false hopes. Why would we be so stupid as to ignore the undeniable success of the American economy, which has fueled the greatest global economic expansion this world has ever seen over the last 238 years, lifting American and worldwide standard of livings and more than doubling our life expectancy? The insidious reality is that our very success and the size of our economy makes for a fertile garden for the lies and promises of the looters and moochers who wish to act as parasites upon the productive. But ultimately, we will reach an economic tipping point from which there is no return. There are two fundamental shifts which America must make in order to move back away from this approaching tipping point. First, we must immediately begin to reduce our current and ongoing budget deficit. This will require two steps. The first is to make a balanced budget a requirement of our federal government, either through constitutional amendment or as a voter-enforced political imperative. The second is to immediately take stock of our spending at all levels of government and begin privatizing as many departments as possible, such as the Postal Service. Further, we must listen to our Founding Fathers' words and constantly caution ourselves to limit government to only those essential duties such as defense, treasury, and agencies necessary to ensuring fair and open competition. All of the other activities of government must be reassessed and either eliminated, made efficient, or moved to the states for review and a determination of their effectiveness. However, most important of these two items is a balanced budget process. Over the past 9 years, we've increasingly had deficit spending at the federal level. This type of spending makes Congress incapable of controlling government spending and allows our politicians to avoid making hard decisions. A great example was the recent handling of the crisis in our veteran healthcare system. This system was initiated following World War II in a very appropriate endeavor to give proper medical care to the hundreds of thousands of returning veterans. Our health system at the time could not handle such a load. Without question, we're obligated to give our veterans the best possible health care. This well-intended system has, however, grown inefficient, bureaucratic, and obsolete over the past 30 to 40 years. When it was recognized that this bloated and antiquated system was providing very poor care to our veterans this past year, the system should have been given a thorough review and privatized wherever possible so that our veterans could take advantage of the best healthcare system in the world. By all accounts, this would have provided better care, more timely care, and at substantially lower cost. Instead, Congress and our president decided to do no substantive review. They increased the Veterans Affairs budget, which is already excessive, by another $60 billion annually, and declared the problem solved. The bureaucrats won, and no cost savings or care-enhancing changes were made. If we had a balanced budget process, the politicians would have been required to explain why they need such an increase. Where were they going to get the additional $60 billion? More taxes? Where and upon who? Cost savings in other departments? Where and when? In a deficit spending government, there is no financial discipline which would otherwise force hard decisions to be made. There's nothing harder than the hard work necessary to fix a broken business budget. I've been called upon several times to fix broken businesses. The average American must live with a balanced budget. Most of our states do, but not the federal government. Our founding fathers created our three-part government structure precisely as they did in order to create the tensions necessary for thorough debate of ideas, budgets, and any material shift in national policy. Our current imperial president's use of executive orders, regulation promulgation without legislative authority, deficit spending, and the misuse of regulatory agencies like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the National Labor Relations Board in an effort to avoid the intended legislative process must be stopped. The second fundamental shift, which we must, is that we must reinstitute in our society the teaching of the founding of our country. The philosophical underpinning of our government and our free enterprise, freedoms-based capitalist economy must be understood by the generations of voters in order for them to make informed voting decisions. Many years ago, the liberal left in our society began a slow and methodical push to focus our educational system away from the fundamentals of reading, writing, arithmetic, and American history toward a more modern-day curriculum of social engineering. It is not surprising that our youth today vote more about their wants and needs from government than caring about the sustainability of our society and our economic way of life. They're being taught in far too many of our public schools and universities to be socialists or collectivists. Notwithstanding the centuries of examples which prove that socialism or collectivism as an economic philosophy does not work, we still move to a constant drumbeat of collectivist ideas, Obamacare being our most recent mistake. Collectivist or socialist manifestos would have some merit, but for one insurmountable problem. Human beings are not all the same. We differ in intellectual capability, emotional capability, athletic or physical ability, energy levels, aggressive or passive tendencies, health realities, our appearance, and even our social tendencies. As such, creating a society which is based upon expecting people to perform based upon their abilities, but to expect compensation only based upon their needs, is destined to failure. Only a fool would look at the economic history of the world's nations and continue to propose collectivism as a stable, long-term solution. It is our very differences as humans which make a freedoms-based, capitalistic, and free enterprise-based society the only rational, long-term societal solution. Those who choose to aggressively pursue a self-sustaining lifestyle will be rewarded for their efforts and accomplishments based upon the value a free society will place upon the productive output which they produce. People truly free to pursue their personal best interests will be happy to fund support for the truly needy in our society because it is in all of our collective interest to have communities which care for those unable to care for themselves. We would gladly fund our local police and national defense because we can only be truly free if we're protected from the evil intentions of others. Freedom, free enterprise, objectivism does not mean there should be no government, but it does mean there should be limited government. Government limited to those functions which we as a society can only accomplish through effectively shared resources. It should not be a government which attempts to regulate and oversee every aspect of our lives as our current government has evolved into. While social safety nets are appropriate for those mentally or physically incapable of their own support, such safety nets as we have developed in America now trap second and third generation families in a life of despair because we have taken away from them their motivation for self-survival and their personal responsibilities. We have taught them to believe that income inequality is someone else's fault and that they are unfairly treated even though we require them to produce no value for society. A great deal of our nation's slide into collectivism has been our politicians' ability to take from the productive and give to the less productive in order to pander for votes behind the costume of caring. Such caring in reality is skin deep. No one who truly cares for another human being would attempt to trap them into a life of poverty just for another vote. A second strongly contributing factor to our nation's slide into collectivism has been many of our business leaders, such as I mentioned Warren Buffett, knowingly pandering to our government in support of collectivist policies in exchange for favoritism, government handouts, and legislative protections. Consider the absurdity of several American states and their governments providing billions of dollars of state subsidies for Tesla Motors, the luxury electric car manufacturer, to lure their manufacturing to their state, in addition to the billions of dollars of tax credits provided by our federal government to wealthy people for buying $80,000 to $100,000 electric automobiles. If such vehicles were economically competitive, why would any subsidies be necessary? Such financial waste has to be stopped, and our government has got to stop manipulating free markets. Examples of ineffective and inefficient governmental manipulation of our financial marketplace, the energy industry, and many others are becoming the rule, not the exception. We must return our society to the basics, the fundamentals of the society and the free enterprise economy which our founding fathers created almost 250 years ago. The economic engine which they unleashed has advanced every aspect of the world's standard of living and life expectancy through the competitive juices which flow from man's freedom to reason, dream, pursue, and achieve his and her dreams. Yes, we can and should take care of the vulnerable in our society, but not the able-bodied who choose not to try. Yes, we must have fair and open competition, but government should not attempt to pick winners and losers through regulating schemes which slant the playing field in one direction or another. Yes, freedom, free enterprise, and capitalism will create wealth disparity, but that's okay, as long as such disparity is based upon a free market valuation methodology demonstrated by people's decisions when spending their hard-earned capital. However, it must not be forgotten that the economic growth which is created by free enterprise, while creating income inequality, has also created the world's strongest economy and has made every economic strata in America the envy of the world. Yes, we pay athletes, movie stars, CEOs, and inventors great amounts of money. However, if that's how our economy rewards their productive talent, so be it. Under a socialist or collectivist economy, it would be true that athletes, actors, CEOs, and inventors would be far less wealthy, unless they had friends in government, but the poor would be poorer. That is hardly an argument in favor of collectivism. History has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that a freedoms-based society which embraces a capitalistic free enterprise system will outperform both economically and socially any other form of government invented to date. That is not to say that such a system is perfect or without disparities amongst its population. But that is to be expected because we are humans and we are neither perfect nor without our differences. It is therefore not surprising that a system which acknowledges our human realities materially outperforms one which assumes we're intellectually limited clones which must be controlled by some superior being often referred to as a bureaucrat. We, the living, rational, and capable, must reject such notions. It's a clear philosophical difference in approaches. Ayn Rand laid out these two philosophical approaches in her masterpiece Atlas Shrugged nearly 60 years ago. Its message rings truer today than at any time in history. Atlas is indeed shrugging under the unsustainable weight of $17.5 trillion in debt, a demotivating and broken welfare state, excessive regulation and antiquated taxation, long-term deficit spending, and a lack of political will and, importantly, integrity, which continues to add straw after straw to Atlas's already considerable load. The philosophical question which Ayn Rand has placed before us will be answered, either intentionally or by inactivity. But remember, doing nothing is in fact doing something. Thank you for your attention this evening. I'll be glad to entertain any questions.